Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to this Aberlin Ao Vivo Linguistics Online talk session. I'm Gerd Westermann. I'm a professor at Lancaster University in the UK, where I study infant development. I am the moderator. The original moderator, Ali Norandi, unfortunately couldn't come. So I'm officially the discussant for after the talk, but I'm now also the moderator for before the talk, but I've been instructed what to do. So I have introduced myself and the series, the Aberlin Ao Vivo Linguistics Online, which is an initiative of the Brazilian Linguistics Association. So this is the talk today. I would like to introduce Professor Nivedita Mani, our speaker today. She's from the University of Göttingen in Germany, and she's very well known for her work on early language development, from early phonological development, the development of lexical representations, to early word learning in different circumstances in monolinguals and bilinguals. And more recently, she's also come to a focus on active learning, on curiosity-based learning. So I think the talk today will be about that topic. Her talk is called Little Scientists and Social Apprentices in Early Word Learning. We thank her for the collaboration and the willingness to give the talk here. I'd like to remind all people listening that you can ask questions in the chat, and after Nivi's talk, I will ask a few questions, and I hope we will have an open discussion with everybody who has anything to comment or ask. So without further ado, then let's hand over to Nivi.
All right. Thank you, Gerd, and thank you, Aberlin, for asking me to give this talk on our recent work on, as Gerd mentioned already, active learning and curiosity-driven learning in early childhood. I'm going to just quickly share my screen so that you have an idea as to what I'm talking about. And then hopefully that's working okay for everyone who's watching, anyone who's watching, everyone who's watching. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about some of our recent work. My talk, as Gerd already mentioned, is titled Little Scientists and Social Apprentices in Early Word Learning. And I thought I'd take a little bit of the time right at the beginning to talk about what exactly I mean. For those who are familiar with the terms already, the cues in the title. So I'm hoping with my talk to bring together Piagetian and Vygostkian approaches to early word learning with this more Piagetian view of science, of babies as little scientists who actively explore the world around them and seek out what, when, and whom to learn from, which for me stands in parallel, shall we say, to more Vygostkian approaches that look at children as little apprentices who learn from knowledgeable others. And what I'm hoping to do in this talk is bring together these two approaches to focus on language learning as a dynamic interaction between small children and their caregivers. So that's kind of the talk in a nutshell. And with that, I'll move on to talk a little bit more about it. So the Vygostkian approach, what's also called pedagogical approaches to language learning, highlights that children are like little apprentices. All of this is quotes from Vygotsky and from the pedagogical approaches, who learn from benevolent experts, so people who are already in possession of the information that the child is hoping to acquire, who also make sure that they highlight the important parts of the interaction for the child. So it's not the case that we as caregivers, we as people, as benevolent experts, are flooding the child with unfiltered information, but we're actually presenting them with structured input, with optimally structured input, which we intuitively structure for the child in order to make it as easy as possible for the child to extract the information that is relevant to the particular interaction. In particular, natural pedagogical approaches focus on the fact that we as adults provide ostensive cues to the child, which allow the child to, which are a cue to the child as to the fact that whatever's coming up next is going to be important for the child to pay attention to. Some natural pedagogical approaches go with the position that the child's sensitivity to such ostensive signals, the child's ability to tune into such ostensive signals as cues to the relevance of a particular interaction, might also be innate. This is something that distinguishes us from our closest neighbors, non-human primates. And that such ostensive cues are also structured in the linguistic input so as to trigger an expectation in the child that the information that is going to be provided in tandem with this ostensive cue is going to be generalizable information. It's going to be information that the child can then infer generalizes to not just the particular input that it has been provided with, but also to other input that is similar to what the child has been provided with. Recently, I've been thinking about this a bit more because I feel like this is entirely in keeping with some more theoretical work that goes along with the suggestion that there is an association between the amount of care and the amount of input that we as humans need as young babies and the superior cognitive abilities required as caregivers in order to nurture such helpless young babies. So this is a fantastic paper by Piagetian and Kidd, which goes over, which suggests that there is this association between the neediness of babies in the human species and the brains that we as caregivers need in order to care for such needy babies. For me, to a certain extent, this is already bringing together the pedagogical approaches with the cognitive abilities that are required in the adult of the human species. At the same time, there's been a recent surge in more curiosity-driven approaches to language learning, which suggests that babies, children, like little scientists, actively shape their learning experience by selectively sampling from the information presented to them. So in this case, what we're talking about is the fact that the baby is actually provided with vast quantities of input. And regardless of whether there might be ostensive cues that structure these vast quantities of input for the child, what is also required of in the child is that the child actively filters out the input that is more relevant to the child at this particular point, that can, according to some approaches, optimally foster further knowledge acquisition in the child, that the child is specifically choosing information that is optimally tailored to further their state of knowledge. At this point, I would like to take a couple of minutes to define what exactly I mean by curiosity, because this is one of the terms that is discussed so much in the literature and has so many different definitions, which are also tailored to different aspects of the research on curiosity-driven learning. And for me, curiosity is something which I will go with the old William James definition, is an impulse towards better cognition. It is, if you want, a drive state for information, a need to acquire further information about the world around us. I am therefore not necessarily coupling it with some sort of intrinsic motivation in order to acquire information. And I'm actually going to attempt later on to bring together this intrinsic and extrinsic motivation to acquire further information, and suggest that curiosity is merely a search for information about the world around us. There's been a lot of work that suggests that there is that this kind of impulse towards further information is associated with fitness benefits, especially with regards to active exploration in dynamically changing contexts. For instance, most readily associated with the active exploration by non-human primates in changing environments, which leads to the more active explorers being able to find the tastier fruit, or being able to find fruit at all in the ever-changing world that we live in. In the field of educational psychology, there's been a lot of work looking at the extent to which there's an association between curiosity and knowledge acquisition, with meta-analysis showing that there's a powerful influence association between curiosity and knowledge acquisition, as well as children's perseverance in tasks that they tend to persevere more when they are actively eliciting the information, or actively interested in a particular topic. In the field of neuroscience, there's been a lot of work suggesting that curiosity activates the reward network in the brain, which in turn is linked to dopamine release, especially in the hippocampal memory system, which then leads back to the fact that information that is actively acquired is then also better retained because of this dopamine release linked to in the hippocampal memory system. Across a variety of studies in a variety of different fields, there's been a lot of work talking about the fact that curiosity is also modulated by a range of higher level and lower level factors, as I call them. So from the higher level factors, we're talking about things like what knowledge the child already has, how familiar a particular input is to the child, or how novel it is, how complex it is, how salient it is, just at the very basic perceptual level of how bright or colorful something is, as well as things like the child's affective and mental state, which is something I'll be coming back to towards the end of my talk. What I'm going to suggest is sort of merging these two approaches. What I'm going to push for is merging these two approaches, which I see as the love child of pedagogical and curiosity-driven approaches, because from what we can see, the pedagogical approaches tend to focus more on the role of the caregiver in providing this child with optimal input that is ideally suited to advance the child's knowledge state. While the curiosity-driven approaches tend to focus on the fact that the child selects certain sources of input and pays selective attention to certain sources of input as opposed to the others. And I'm going to suggest then this feedback loop between the pedagogical and curiosity-driven approaches, which leads to the child's interest in certain sources of information, then also furthering the kind of input that the child receives about things that it is more interested in. So what I'm going to suggest through this talk is the fact that not only is it the case that we as caregivers provide children with input that is optimally tailored to their further knowledge acquisition, and not only is it the case that children actively recruit information that they are particularly interested in, but also that there's this feedback between the caregiver and child that leads to the child's interest in any particular source of input, leading to the caregiver providing more optimal input in a particular topic that the child is more interested in. So for me, when we ask the question, how do children then learn words? I see learning as a mutual dynamic interaction between input, or the caregiver, and the child. So one of the things that should be immediately clear is that language is acquired knowledge. So naturally, what the child hears and what the child sees is going to shape what the child learns. The child cannot learn language without being exposed to language. But at the same time, there's also a lot of our research, which I'm going to present today in this talk, suggesting that the child and what she already knows and what she's interested in and whether she's interested is also associated with the child's learning progress. And further, in turn, that what the child is interested in shapes how she will be exposed to particular things in the future. So this kind of view of learning as this dynamic mutual interaction between the input and the child, for me, brings together curiosity-driven and pedagogical approaches to highlight the changing dynamics of more child-driven and caregiver-driven forces in early learning. So let me try and convince you of that. I'm essentially going to go through each of these points that I've made to then bring together these curiosity and pedagogical approaches to early learning. Let's start off with the first thing that I said, that what the child knows is going to boost learning in particular areas as opposed to other areas. We started looking at this quite a while ago with what still is till today one of my favorite experiments in this topic. This was with Nicole Altvater-Mackinson, and was then continued with Melly Schreiner, who were both in my group, where we started to think about the extent to which babies' familiarity with particular words would lead to them selectively learning words that sound similar to the words that they know, before learning other words that don't sound similar to the words that they know. So in particular, in this particular task, we got 6 to 7.5-month-olds into the lab, and we exposed them to a word. In this case, let's say the word is tacker. And we essentially just brought these kids in and we said the word tacker to them for about 100 seconds. Tacker, 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 until the baby, until we were sure that the child was familiar with this word tacker that we presented to the child. And then we presented the child with sentences containing a similar sounding word, in this case, the word tasser. And we examined the extent to which babies who had previously been exposed to the word tacker were better able to segment a similar sounding word like tasser from the speech stream. And we found that indeed, recent word form familiarity does boost children's segmentation of words from the fluent speech stream. This was already for me a key finding which motivated the direction that my research has taken since this paper in 2013. Because if you imagine this, it means that every single word that the baby learns acts as a magnet for other words that sound similar things, or as some other recent work of ours has shown, mean similar things. So you have these attractors in the early lexicon that are going to drive the child in a particular path. It's going to lead to the child learning words that are similar in other overlapping dimensions. Of course, then the question comes up to what extent this actually reflects what's going on in the child's daily life, because it's not often or not ever the case that the child is exposed to a particular word for 100 seconds and then is immediately exposed to sentences containing similar words. So we wanted to bring this more to what might actually be happening in the child's life. And we looked at the extent to which familiarity with a word that the child already knew. So in this case, we looked at children whose parents had told us that they already knew the word bed. And without familiarizing them during the experiment to the word bed, we looked at the extent to which babies who were familiar with the word bed were better able to segment a similar sounding word like beck from the speech stream. And again, we found very similar effects, that babies who were familiar with the word bed were then attending more to words like beck in the speech stream and were able to segment these words out from the fluent speech stream. Importantly, what we were also able to look at here is the fact that it wasn't just the case that babies were confusing the word beck for bed, that beck wasn't just a bad beck. To the extent that we showed the same babies pictures of a bed and a diaper, and then we told the babies to either look at the bed or to look at the beck. And what we see here in the black line is babies' fixations to the picture of the bed when they hear the word bed. And we can see that they're clearly differentiating between, they're clearly looking at the picture of the bed when they hear the word bed. And the blue line shows us what happens to the infant's pattern of fixations when they hear the word beck instead. And we see that although these fixations start off in a similar way, that soon after they've heard the end of this word, that babies then show a sensitivity to the fact that beck is not a bed. So it's actually the case that babies are picking out these similar words from the speech stream and are still able to maintain these words as separate representations and are not confusing the word beck for the word bed. In other words, the knowledge that a baby has the ability to lead the child down a completely unique path, given the degree of overlap that there are in any case between early words that children knows. But it has the ability to lead the child along a unique path where it is acquiring certain words easier than other words because they sound similar to words that the words that the child already knows. The words that the child knows, what the child knows, then has an impact on what the child is more easily able to learn. Then the next step we took this to is to look at the extent to which what babies were interested in shapes what baby is likely to learn. This follows directly from the work that Nicole and Melly and I did in 2013, because we started to then think about whether it was actually the case that babies were going down a unique path with regards to the words that they were acquiring. There's been some lovely work by Julian Mayor and Kim Plunkett, which talks about the degree to which there's overlap in the lexicons of young babies and the extent to which that overlaps continues across early development. And we started asking the question, well, why isn't there overlap in the words that babies learn? One possible explanation for this is obviously the input. So maybe not all babies know all the same words because they haven't heard mommy and daddy say the same words to the same extent. But we also wanted to look at it from another way with regards to the extent to which baby steers her own learning by attending more to things that she might be more interested in. So to look at this, we ran a series of experiments where we looked at the extent to which we could get some sort of index of what babies are interested in, and we used 2 indices across most of the studies. Although I'm happy to talk about what these indices mean really during the discussion. But we had, on the one hand, we had parents tell us what they thought their baby was interested in. So was their child more interested in animals, or more interested in vehicles, or more interested in furniture, or more interested in clothes? And we had them rate the kinds of things that their child was interested in. And that was one of our indices of what the child is interested in. And the other index of what another index of what children were interested in was obtained from children's pupillary arousal to familiar images. In essence, we just showed babies images of familiar objects from a range of different natural language categories. And we looked at the extent to which babies showed increased pupillary arousal for members of a particular category as opposed to the other. And we used this difference in pupillary arousal to familiar images from different categories as one index of babies' arousal following presentation of different familiar objects. And we looked at the extent to which babies learned novel word object associations easier when they were more interested in the categories that these objects were from. In other words, if mommy has told us that baby really likes animals, then is it the case that that child finds it easier to learn a new animal name as opposed to a new vehicle name? So this was work with Lena Ackerman. She's got a series of studies on this, and this is some of her latest work looking at the extent to which children's interest in particular categories is associated with improved learning of novel word object associations in this category. So what I'm plotting here is the change in pupil dilation. So a greater increase in pupil dilation is one of our indices of babies' arousal following presentation of members of particular semantic categories. And we've got the proportion of target looking down on the x-axis, and the greater the proportion of target looking is, the better children are showing learning and retention of novel word object associations from these categories. So essentially, you want to see a linear pattern here that babies who are showing increased pupillary arousal to particular semantic categories are also learning novel word object associations in those categories better. We looked at this at 2 time points because we weren't just interested in the extent to which children were learning and showing immediate recognition of these newly learned novel word object associations. But we also wanted to look at babies' retention of these newly learned word object associations over a longer time period. So T2 was about 5 minutes after they had been exposed to these novel word object associations, and T3 was 24 hours later. And we looked at the extent to which we could find an association between children's pupillary arousal to certain category members and the proportion of their target looking 5 minutes after they had been introduced to these novel word associations and 24 hours later. And what we find is that lexical acquisition and retention, and I'm going to be very careful when I say this, as I'm going to just say it's mathematically predicted by children's individual interests. This was only in the younger age group of children that we tested. So we tested 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds in this task. And the 3-year-olds learned and retained the words regardless of whether they were interested in it, regardless of whether their parents had said they were interested in it. They were just very good at learning words and learned and retained our novel word object associations without any problem. The 2-year-olds, however, their learning and retention was mathematically predicted by the extent to which both their parents had told us that they were interested in these particular novel object categories, and the extent to which, sorry, I've got the window open here because it's a very hot day in Germany, and the extent to which children showed increased pupillary arousal to objects from particular semantic categories. So essentially what we're saying is that what baby is interested in is also associated with what kinds of words baby is likely to learn, which might go some of the way towards explaining why there isn't complete overlap in the vocabularies of early children. I have 2 little boys myself, and I can tell you that the kinds of words that they knew early in development differed quite dramatically. And in fact, that was one of the main reasons that we went along this path, is to sort of explain whether it was the case that the one kid of mine who's very interested in animals, that the reason that he knew so many more animal names was driven by the fact that he was more interested in it. And the reason that his younger brother, who was more interested in vehicles, the reason that he knew more vehicle names was because he's more interested in vehicles per se. And what we're showing here is at least a mathematical relationship between the extent to which children are interested in particular categories like animals and vehicles, and the extent to which they learn and retain novel word object associations in those categories. We then decided to zoom out a little bit from all of this and go away from the extent to which babies were particularly interested in certain objects in the world around them, and look instead at the question of whether baby is intrinsically interested in learning, whether baby wants to learn words. Because maybe a very, very small, admittedly, a very small part of why babies learn words is because baby wants to learn words. Is there any sort of intrinsic motivation in the child to learn words? Such an intrinsic motivation could either be completely child-driven, Or it may have a more social component to it with regards to the fact that baby needs to learn words in order to communicate with the people around them. So there might actually be concurrent forces working on the child's motivation to learn words, leading babies to want to learn words. We looked at this with regards to the question of whether baby was intrinsically motivated to learn, i.e. whether learning words is rewarding in and of itself in young children. There's been a lot of work looking at this with adults with regard to the extent to which that reward regions, the ventral striatum, is activated during successful word learning in adults, which has also led to suggestion that there might be increased weighting of intrinsically motivated mechanisms, particularly in the human species, because of this coupling of the motivational circuitry and the learning circuitry in particular to the human species. That we as humans may be intrinsically and motivated to acquire more information about the world around us. I will caveat this with a number of findings, especially a very recent paper talking about how chimpanzees navigate and explore virtual environments in a very similar way to how humans. So I'm not sure the extent to which we want to attribute this as a specifically human ability, but at the very least, we wanted to ask the question as to whether babies find learning rewarding in and of itself, whether baby is interested in learning, and whether baby's interest in learning per se explains some of the variability in baby's learning success. We looked at this in a task where we had two different measures, which for us were trying to capture baby's intrinsic motivation to learn. The first was, again, pupillary arousal. So we taught baby a series of novel word object associations using the cross-situational learning task. And then we measured baby's pupillary arousal before and after the task to examine the extent to which those babies who showed increased pupillary arousal during the task were then also those babies who showed improved novel word recognition, learning of the novel word object associations during the task. And indeed, we found with regards to babies' learning of novel word object associations, that those babies who showed increased pupillary engagement during the task of learning novel word object associations were also those kids who showed improved recognition of the novel word object associations learned later at test. We didn't find a similar association with regards to babies' recognition of familiar words, suggesting that to a certain extent this might be quite specific to babies' learning and recognition of novel word object associations that they had been exposed to in the task. Another measure that we looked at here was also baby's chest height, because there's been a lot of lovely recent work, especially by Robert Hebach and colleagues, looking at the extent to which an increase in upper body posture may be an index of the positive emotions felt by a child during task completion or task success, such that the more upright the baby's posture is after completion of the task, the more we are able to infer some sort of positive emotion in the child due to task completion. So Robert Hebach and colleagues have a number of beautiful studies showing that babies who successfully complete a task walk with a more upright body posture after they've completed the task. Babies who've helped somebody achieve a goal also walk with a similarly more upright posture once they have helped somebody. Tying a lot of these changes in upper body posture to the kind of emotions, the affective state of the child following task completion. And we wanted to look at the extent to which those babies who showed improved word learning also showed increased upper body posture following successful word learning, to the extent to which babies feel positive emotions upon learning words as our index of whether learning is rewarding in and of itself for the child. And we found here only a difference between babies' recognition of familiar words and novel words, where we found a more upright upper body posture after babies completed a task where they were presented with the task of recognizing a series of familiar word object associations, whereas they actually showed less upright upper body posture following a task where they had to recognize a series of newly learned word object associations. This was also mirrored in our own behavioral analyses of what babies seemed like after the task. So typically these kinds of tasks do a valence rating of the child, where you have an independent blind coder coding whether the child is feeling more positive emotions or more negative emotions in a particular video clip, whether the number of frames that they're smiling. And from such measures, you get a valence rating for the child, where the more positive the valence rating is, the more happy an observer codes the baby to seem. And the more negative the valence rating is, the less positive the child appears to be. And we found that the valence rating was completely coherent with the change in chest height, where those babies where babies showed increased positive emotions according to the valence rating following the familiar word recognition task, but not the novel word recognition task. In other words, what we're seeing here is that babies are showing us some sort of index of positive emotions when they've completed a task that is perhaps more familiar to them, that's perhaps easier relative to a task that's more difficult. In this case, they're showing us increased positive emotions when they complete a familiar word recognition task relative to a novel word recognition task. What we found no evidence of is any sort of endogenous component to learning per se, because we found no evidence of an association between babies' novel word recognition success and changes to their upper body posture or changes to their valence as coded by an independent observer. So there was no association between how well babies had learned the newly learned novel word object associations and how happy they were feeling. So that endogenous component to learning, the question as to whether babies are intrinsically motivated to learn, the question as to whether babies feel positive emotions upon learning something, that still remains unanswered. We didn't find any evidence of it. And there's a number of reasons, obviously, why we didn't find any evidence of it. I think it's easier to notice that you've helped somebody than to notice that you've learned a word. So maybe what we're lacking when it comes to word learning is this awareness that we have successfully completed a task. And we're working on different ways now where we can make babies more aware of the fact that they have successfully learned a word and look at the extent to which that triggers positive emotions in the child. At the very least, the pupillary data then brings us back to the point where we're showing that what baby is engaged in, that when baby is engaged in particular tasks, that baby then also shows increased learning success, suggesting that at least that degree of pupillary engagement appears to mathematically predict babies' improvements in learning, but we're not seeing this endogenous component to learning with regards to babies being intrinsically motivated to learn. I'm now then going to try and bring together, as promised, these two different approaches with regards to the extent to which what the child is interested in shapes how she will be exposed to particular things in the future. Because to a certain extent, the question that immediately arises when we say things like, babies learn words easier, when they're more interested in particular topic, is the extent to which we as caregivers are aware of what our children are interested in, and may then also provide them with more input that we assume them to be more interested in. So there's a lot of work that suggests that we as caregivers structure the environment for the child, that we buy children books on topics that we know them to be interested in, that we take them to museums where there are particular exhibits that we know them to be interested in, that we talk to them more about things that we think they're more interested in, suggesting that there may actually be this feedback loop between the child's interests and how sensitive we as caregivers are to what our child might be interested in, leading to us providing the child with more input or more high quality input regarding things that we know them to be more interested in. We looked at this in a recent project, which is work by Raji Madhavan, where we again asked parents to tell us what kinds of books their child was more or less interested in. And then we recorded parents and children during a shared book reading session, comparing books that the parents had previously told us that their child was very interested in relative to books where the parents had previously told us that their child was not so interested in. And we then had blind independent coders rating the quality of interaction between the parent and the child during this shared book reading session. So this quality of interaction score was a summed score of a range of different attributes of the interaction. So the extent to which there was joint attention towards the book during the shared book reading session, the range of motion that the child showed during the book reading session, the extent to which the child pointed at particular points, at particular parts of the book, and the extent to which the parent, how much of attention the parent showed to the book as opposed to the child, how much attention the child showed to the book and to the parent, leading us to this summed quality of interaction score. And we were interested in the question as to what extent there were differences in the quality of interaction during a shared book reading session when parent and child were reading a book that the child was very interested in, as opposed to when the child wasn't so interested in the book. And indeed, we found that there was a significant difference in the quality of interaction. So caregivers and children reading a book that the caregiver knows to be of high interest to the child leads to the interaction between the child and the caregiver being of higher quality, with greater interaction between the caregiver and the child, with greater joint attention, with a greater range of motion, with the child pointing more, when the book is of high interest to the child relative to when the book is of low interest to the child. So it may not just be the case that children learn better when they are more interested in something, but children's interest in particular topics, especially parents' assumption of children's interests in particular topics, may lead to the caregiver and child engaging in more high quality interactions relative to when the parent assumes that the child is not so interested in something that they're talking about, which could then be a further boost to learning about things that the child is interested in. Indeed, we then looked at this with regards to learning, where at the end of this interaction, this shared book reading interaction, we then looked at the extent to which babies showed us learning of novel word object associations that they had been introduced to during the shared book reading session. And we found a positive relationship between the quality of the interaction and children's learning of novel word object associations. So babies showed improved learning of the novel word object associations that were embedded in the book when the quality of the interaction was greater, which sort of completes this feedback loop that I was talking about, that the child's interest and parents' assumption that the child is interested in a particular topic improves the quality of interaction between the caregiver and the child with regards to the topic, which then also feeds forward to improved learning of objects being presented in that topic for that particular child. However, we did find that not much evidence, at least for the indices that we were tapping into, for an association between parental estimates of what the child was interested in and the child's behavior. In particular, we asked parents, as we typically do, to tell us what kinds of objects that their child was interested in. And at the same time, we gave children a looking time task. We didn't have a pupillary task in this study because it was an online study, pandemic driven. We only had looking behavior. And we showed babies images of a series of objects from a range of different categories. And we used the amount of time that they looked at objects from different categories as an index of their interest in those categories. And when we just took the best ranked category with regards to babies' looking preference and the category that parents reported their child to be most interested in, we find very little association between parental estimates and children's looking time behavior. In particular, in most of the cases, so in a majority of the cases, parents chose a category to be of highest interest to the child, which was not a category that the child showed the highest amount of looking time to. And it was only a minority of cases where there was an overlap between parents' assumption that their child was interested in a particular topic and children's looking behavior. That's, however, only when we consider the top choice. When we look at the top 3 choices of the parent, where we looked at the first 3 categories that the parent reported the child to be interested in, and the first 3 categories according to looking time behavior that the child, that our index of looking time behavior suggested the child was more interested in, there we see greater coherence, suggesting that at the very least, and I'm going to be very tentative when talking about this because we're talking about the top 3 choices, at the very least, at the very most, there's a very coarse association between parental estimates of their child's interest and children's behavior. So it's not the case that we as parents, as caregivers, are finely tuned in to children's interests. And it's not the case that looking behavior is giving us a perfect estimate of what the child is interested in. There seems to be some sort of mismatch between these 2 indices. And Raji currently has a project which is working on figuring out which of these, why there is so little coherence between these 2 measures and what these 2 measures might be in addition tapping into. However, what we are seeing is this association between the quality of interaction between caregiver and child and parents' assumption of what their child is interested in, giving me support, suggesting support for this interpretation that I have, that there's this feedback loop between what a child is interested in and the extent to which that influences the parent in the kinds of interactions she engages with her child, leading to higher quality interactions when the child is more interested in something. In other words, what the child is interested in is also going to influence how the child is introduced to certain topics in the future, as we've already seen with older kids, that we as caregivers buy more books for children in topics that we think them to be interested in, that we talk to them more about these topics. We're also seeing that at a younger age with regards to toddlers, that parents and children engage in more high quality interactions when the child is more interested in a particular topic. That brings me back then to this question that I started off with regards to how children learn words. And I hope that with this talk and these snippets of some of our research in the last years, I've sort of convinced you that what we need in order to better understand learning is to look at the dynamic nature of caregiver-child interactions, because obviously language is acquired knowledge. So the child needs to hear language from others who already know this language in order to learn it. But at the same time, the child is not this unwitting receptacle for information, and the child actively steers when, what, from whom. We've got some other research showing that children are also selective with regards to whom they learn particular things from, and potentially even why they want to learn with regards to this pupillary engagement that we saw in the task looking at whether babies are intrinsically motivated to learn, and also how we as adults impart information to the child. So it's not just the case that we as adults intuitively provide ostensive cues with regards to what the child should pay more attention to, but we seem to also be influenced by what we think our child is interested in, and then provide more high quality input with regards to topics that we assume our children to be more interested in. And this feedback loop for me suggests that in order to understand how children learn words, that any understanding of early word learning is incomplete without looking at this dance, as it were, between caregivers and children, and the dynamic nature of caregiver-child interactions, where you've got the child bringing in its own input to the task of learning words with regards to what information it's going to pay attention to, who it's going to learn from, when it's going to learn. But at the same time, the child is also a part of steering the quality of interactions between parents and caregivers, not just with regards to the range of motion, to the extent to which it engages in joint attention with the adult in a particular when discussing a particular topic, but also the extent to which the caregiver then brings in a higher quality of interaction in any interactions with the child, when the caregiver assumes that what they're talking about is of interest to the child. So that is going to be the focus of the next few years of my lab, of research in my lab, where we're going to be looking at the extent to which we can tap into the dynamic nature of caregiver-child interactions. So if you're more interested in this, then watch this space. We will hopefully be having lots of exciting research on this topic in the near future. With that, I'm going to thank a whole host of collaborators for all of their efforts with regards to the research that I had the privilege to present here today. And thank you for listening. And I look forward to any questions or any discussion about this work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nivi. Very exciting talk. So this is, I'm not sure what the YouTube screen is now. This is me back, Gerd, the discussant. Your talks are always so inspiring and exciting that my head always spins, and I'm sure my pupils must be very large now. So I hope I can. I hope I can order my thoughts. So we are waiting for questions to come in. But let me maybe say a few words initially why I find this work so exciting and interesting. I think there are two reasons, or probably many more, but let me mention two. One is when you, in the beginning, you talked about these theories that suggest that parents can optimally structure the environment for the child, and the children are attuned to that. To me, that always raises really a learnability problem, because probably parents do that sometimes, but if children were really reliant on that to learn from such an optimal environment, goodness me, they would not learn a lot. So there have to be very strong other mechanisms, right? And of course, this interactive loop that you described very beautifully explains that, or goes some way to explaining that. The other reason is, what I often think is, children learn in the world, and then we bring them to the lab and expose them to some studies. I always think it's kind of an epiphenomenon of their real world behavior, what they do in a lab, right? And on your last slide, you said the children are not an unwitting receptacle for information, but of course, largely that is what we assume in lab-based studies, right? We put them in front of a screen, we show them certain information in random order. Nobody in a lab, a word learning study, will normally control for which words the children already know, whether they know bugger or bear, for example, two German words that you've been using as a contrast, animals versus machinery or so. So we assume that on average, all children more or less function the same. And I think what your work so beautifully shows is that each child has a very individual learning trajectory that can diverge very early on. So very, very nice and very exciting. One thing, a little piece of the puzzle that you didn't talk about and that I just would like to briefly add is, so you said you're combining the Piaget and Vygostky by the child exploring the world and parents, social partners, kind of teaching the child. There is a little extension to that the child not only explores the world, but the child also actively solicits information from adults, right? So it's not just that adults attune to the child's interests and then shape the environment according to that. But we know from early on, from babbling, pointing, eye gaze, children holding out things to parents, children looking at parents when they want a piece of information, that they don't only explore the world, but they also use social partners to help finding answers in the world when they cannot gain them themselves, right? So I think that's kind of another aspect of this interactive loop.
If I can sort of just come in on that, because so the first part of what you said is speaking directly to my heart. You and I have always had a connection on this regard. Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar. This is now my new favorite quote, but I recently read this paper by Uri Bronfenbrenner, who talked about the fact that most of developmental, I think this is a paper from like the 60s or the 70s, and he talks about the fact that most of developmental psychology is the science of strange babies in strange situations, interacting with strange people, doing things they will never, I'm paraphrasing the quote, but there's essentially a lot of strange in there. And that's exactly what we've been doing. That's exactly what I've been doing for a really long time, that we brought these kids into this gray lab and we got them to look at pictures that they had never seen before that were perfectly controlled. So the gray in the background of the images matched across all of the images. So there's nothing that would distract the child. And that's clearly not how life takes place. Which is why I think we need to be moving to these more naturalistic designs where we're watching the caregiver and child play together. And I know that you're doing this as well with your head-mounted eye tracker, but I feel very clearly that that is the direction that we need to go in. And it's not going to be easy. I mean, just this book reading study, I think we finished collecting data a year ago, and we still have not completed coding the data set. There's so much to be done with these naturalistic interactions. So it's not going to be very easy, but I do think that that is something that we need to be doing with regards to getting a better grip on what children are learning. With regards to active learning, there's actually some data that I haven't presented yet because I haven't been able to bring it into the story because it obviously ruins my beautiful story that I've put together. At some point, it's going to come into one of my talks, maybe at Lancaster. But we've got some new data suggesting that babies, well, older children, so these are 4 to 5-year-olds, are really crap at eliciting information that they really need. So this is a task where initially when we set up the experiment, I thought, this is a no-brainer. Of course they know that they need this information, and of course they're going to choose what they need. It's essentially a cross-situational learning task. And after the cross-situational learning task, we show the babies the images that they were presented in the task and ask them to tell us whether they know the name of the image or not. And then they're very good at telling us. They actually are quite good at estimating whether they know the name of an object or not. They're very good at that. And then we give them an opportunity to choose to hear the names of objects, of the objects to them. And they don't bloody choose the ones that they don't know the names of. And it's literally, they've just told us they don't know the names of those objects, and then they don't choose those objects. So that's a bit difficult to reconcile with this child who is actively soliciting information that it's desperately in need of. I mean, when we set up this study, I was so sure it was going to work. I thought, why are we even running this study? And now we found they're not soliciting it. We do still find an active advantage in that those kids who didn't know much and who accurately told us that they hadn't learned much did have an advantage by being able to sample. So we're looking at that into more detail, but it's at least not the case that they're so strategic about soliciting information. This is actually quite consistent with kids in this age. I mean, Jenny Safran and Martin Setterson have this lovely study where they go through a series of experiments trying to get kids to choose information that they need. And it's only when you make it so abundantly clear to the child that they need something that they will then go and choose it. So I don't think the child is this is going around the world just picking up the information that it absolutely needs. I think there's a bit of room for error there.
That's really interesting. We have a study, you may know, with Marina Bazidai and Eugenio Parisi, where we have two informants with an infant, and they're presented with objects and that they know, and one of the informants always labels the object, the other one interacts also with the child, but doesn't label the object. So one of the informants is a labeler, the other one isn't. And then finally, after they've done it a few times, they are presented with an object, a novel object, where they couldn't know the name. And it's always the parent handing out the object, and the parent asks, "What is this?" And so the parent asks, "What's this?" And Marina found that the infant then looks at the labeler, although they were both equally actively involved. So specific information seeking from a specific person, but that is, of course, quite different from wanting a specific piece of information across different pieces of information. And I find it really interesting what you say, because I think, you know, that in the past few years, we've got into this curiosity-based learning, and many people have, and there is perhaps a bit of this thinking that, oh, then it's optimal learning. And of course, there are also Bayesian approaches that clearly say the child makes rational decision which next piece of information is the optimal piece to learn. And so it's kind of heartening that children are not so fast, you know.
No.
You know, children are not, I want to close this information gap, but they interact with the world, they want to have fun, and they learn things perhaps on the side. So I think that's really important for us to keep that in mind, that it's a very stochastic and suboptimal thing.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a beautiful way of putting it, because that's exactly what we've seen. And we have, to a certain extent, maybe gotten carried away with this active learning literature. And I will completely agree with you that these results with whom they want to learn from seems very robust. So we've got some data as well, where it's not just that babies. So this is work that came out last year with Friederike Schütte and Tanja Behner, where we showed that babies will also retrospectively adjust the labels they associate with objects based on the information they subsequently get from a person. So they're exposed to two speakers who introduce them to novel word object associations. And then we show them that one of them doesn't quite know what she's talking about, and she keeps getting things wrong. And then later we see that babies then adjust their associations so that they sort of downweight the label given by the person who constantly gets things wrong. So they're able to take that kind of information in. And that's more of a weighting issue, I would say, so how they weight information given to them. But I don't think that they're such optimally Bayesian babies. I've lost my flavor for such optimally Bayesian babies who are only seeking what's going to further their knowledge. I think there's actually some work by Rachid Dubey and Tom Griffiths, which I find is a beautiful model of how babies, it's a model of how adults seek information, but I think it could equally apply to babies, where you've got this balance between complexity and prior knowledge and how often you're likely to encounter certain kinds of information in the future, that sort of that's brought together in the kinds of information that baby actively solicits or adults actively solicit. And that might be some of the suboptimality that we're seeing here. That might be some of the noise that we're seeing, that there's other factors that are just as important, not just knowledge gaps.
No, exactly. And I think as soon as you postulate some kind of optimal mechanism, you always immediately run into a competence performance problem, right? Because then you have your competence, which is optimal, and everything else is noise that's disregarded. And, I think we've learned over the years that it might make sense to look at the noise and see, is the noise systematic as well, and so on. And I think what you just said, that really speaks to that we have to, understand why are they suboptimal, and not just assume that they're purely stochastic. Really great. I'm still waiting for questions from the audience. There aren't any yet, so let me ask.
You and I are just sitting and chatting here.
Yes, what could be better? I have one kind of specific question and then a couple of general ones, if we get to them. So the specific one concerns pupil dilation. Really beautiful results that you had in both studies. I think my question is perhaps more pertinent to the Otis study et al. Namely that, pupil dilation is a marker of arousal, isn't it? But it is also a marker of cognitive effort, right? So can you separate these out? Because, could large pupil dilation mean, oh, I'm really curious about this, I want to learn? Or could it not also mean, oh, I'm really at this moment trying very hard to learn it, so my cognitive effort is high? So how can you separate curiosity, which in a sense comes prior to cognitive engagement and learning, from the cognitive engagement itself?
I don't think you can, which is why I don't know if you noticed, I was very careful about calling it pupillary arousal. So I'm talking about the biological phenomenon that we're seeing. The pupils were aroused.
So you would group around cognitive effort also under pupillary arousal.
Exactly. So the pupil is aroused. That's what we're seeing as far as the index that we're tapping into. And I think that has multiple components to it. And I don't think as yet that my research is able to pull these apart. And I don't know whether we will be able to pull it apart. So when we talk about pupillary arousal, we talk about it in terms of we saw a pupillary dilation, and that's it. And that is an index of the baby's engagement, if you want. It's an index of interest, if you want. I don't think it's one or the other. It can be all of them mixed in together. For me, for the Utes et al. Study, what that's showing us is that baby being into the task, regardless of whether it's interested, it's difficult, it's I really want to learn this. Baby being into the task means baby learns better, which in itself is fine. So it's this task-related effect that we're seeing, this task-based arousal, which then mathematically predicts learning success. That's how we're interpreting those results.
But again, baby being into the task sounds more like motivational. You could also say baby making more cognitive effort has a better learning outcome, which also rings true, doesn't it?
So would you see baby making more cognitive effort as baby being more into the task? I feel like that's a consequence of baby being into the task.
Consequence or cause. Or
cause, exactly. They go together.
It's a question that really, well, I wouldn't say keeps me awake at night, but it's really one that interests me greatly as well. And we are doing some studies on pupil dilation in response to blurred images at the moment, where we hope that we can find some kind of, to isolate the curiosity aspect perhaps of pupil dilation.
How are you going to do that? How are you going to do that?
Okay, it's very early to talk about this. It's just a project we're just starting. What we're doing is we're having a highly blurred image which gets progressively de-blurred, and then we measure pupil dilation across the time course of that. And we want to see, as we know from the literature, from some literature, that intermediate level of blur, people self-report highest curiosity. And so the ideal result would, of course, be that we get a peak at the intermediate level of blur. They're of course all equal for luminosity, etc.
Yeah.
And my real interest is, of course, will we find that, or will we find a progressive dilation, or maybe nothing systematic? And another question we can then ask, do we find individual differences? So would we find individual differences in amplitude or latency of the peak? And does that link with self-reported trait curiosity?
Very interesting. Yeah.
So that's,
that's true. Yeah, I remember being told that you were getting more into the trait curiosity thing.
Which probably links also to a question I want to ask you a bit later. Yes, thanks for that. Still, we have no questions, so I can check.
It's just you and me.
Everyone, feel free to
we
ask.
should do this in a pub.
I hope we can soon do it in Lancaster, yes. Everyone, if you want to follow on this discussion, come to Lancaster. We are running an infancy conference in late August called LCICD.
And you can join this discussion in a pub somewhere in Lancaster.
Yes. Instead of a Brazilian Zoom call where people from Germany and Britain discuss it. Oh, technology is such a miracle. But let me ask you my second question. So you talked about how individual interest and curiosity can account for which words children learn, that they develop very different vocabularies. But of course, a really striking feature of early language word learning is also the different size of vocabulary at different ages. So have you got any thoughts about that? Why do some children learn so many words so much faster than other children?
Yeah, so I guess the start is, and maybe you're coming back to trait curiosity at some point here, but the start is going to be the input for me. So with regards to vocabulary size, I think there's very little getting away from the quality of the input that the child has access to. To be honest, that makes sense. When you just think of the sheer numbers of it, the more words you learn, the more opportunity you have to learn words. And you can't learn a word without hearing it. So therefore, you have to hear a lot in order to learn more words. So I think those are completely tied together. I don't know whether I would see a role for baby in the quantity of language, apart from the fact that you might see certain phonological clusters or semantic clusters around certain pathways that lead to certain babies gaining more words, but you would see that only in those clusters that they're seeing. I mean, we've got a PhD project which is currently looking at this with longitudinal data with regards to the extent to which in a child's vocabulary, we can see the extent to which one word predicts the appearance of another word shortly down the line. So we might be able to say more about that with regards to these clusters and the extent to which these clusters leads to differences in vocabulary size. But I'm not sure to what extent I would pinpoint a role for interest in there. You could go along your direction of trait curiosity or endogenous learning, and with the extent to which certain babies really want to learn language because they really want to communicate with others, or they really just want to learn. And that could be some sort of a factor in these individual differences. But I haven't got data about that yet, so I'm not convinced yet.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I would certainly not think it's one or the other. I think it's a really multifaceted reasons. But of course, a quite well replicated result, as far as I know, is that girls tend to be ahead in vocabulary compared with boys, right? So it cannot, unless you assume that it's purely the language environment, it cannot be purely that, unless you assume that girls get better language environment. It's probably not.
That does tend to flatten out, right? That tends to flatten out. So
after a while,
so it's not a persistent difference, and it might just be something attention related early on, which might have some biological component. So it's not that we're seeing this sort of divergence between girls and boys that remains across development. since it comes together at some point, it might just be that certain attentional processes are coming in later. Yeah. There's the anecdotal evidence of boys in habituation tasks versus girls in habituation tasks, that there's more dropout of boys relative to girls in such tasks. So maybe it's just attention coming in there.
Yeah, but it speaks to this intricate relationship between internal state, internal abilities, and external availability of information. Yeah, of course, from what you said, there could be an explanation, there could be part of it as well, you know, because you said that children learn words better if they're related to words they already know. An implication of that is that the fewer words they know, the harder it will be for them to learn words, right? Yeah. So the more words you know early on, the more easy it will be. You know, you have a head start that diverges. Yeah. Because the more words, then you can learn more and more. And if you don't have that, you will struggle. Yeah, could be perhaps different interacting factors there.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to see the extent to which we see percentile switches in early development. So to what extent are kids going up and down their percentiles, or are they just staying steady? You know, the second kids drop a percentile, as doctors, you start to get very worried. So are we seeing any sort of those changes in language development? Really, I'm not sure I've seen something like that, but that would be one way to look at it.
Could be easily done with the CDI, right? With a longitudinal one. Excellent. Well,
yeah, there we go.
You study.
As usual.
Excellent. Thank you. Oh, there's a question.
There is a question.
Yes, thank you, question asker. I don't know who you are, because the question is cut and pasted to the chat in Zoom. The question is phonology substance-free or phonetically grounded?
I would say, depending on whose perspective you're talking about there. So are we talking about it from the perspective of the child, in which case it is, for me, early on very substance-grounded. It's bottom-up information that then clusters together with regards to forming particular phonemic representations in the child's later language development. If you're talking about it from the view of linguistics, that's a whole different question. What linguists are doing in our departments is something completely different. I assume you're talking about it from the level of the child, in which case I will assume that it is bottom up, early in development, which then leads to the formation of phonological categories that are driven by the clustering of these tokens in early experience.
I think you're answering, or there was a specification I think you have answered, namely, are phonemes ontologically a priori to the signal percept?
No.
I guess you said no, they're not.
Yes. I think you know my answer to that question. Sorry.
So phonemes are shaped through experience with speech sound.
If there's something like a phoneme, I mean, I'm guessing it's probably something like a prototype that's formed from different exemplars in early development.
Yeah. Great. Other people, thanks for this question. Other people feel free to ask more what I'm looking for. Oh yeah, I think so. I had a few that are really a bit more general. So of course, curiosity and motivation are kind of overlapping, and when we say that children are curious learners and some are not, this is just for you to speculate. It doesn't have really anything directly to do with what you mentioned in your talk, but you know, how can we motivate children? How can we make children curious to learn? And of course, we also hear that children, when they enter school, often that they become less curious, they ask fewer questions. So that's almost seems like the holy grail, you know. How can we make children curious to learn?
Yeah, I think maybe we're asking the wrong question then. I don't think we should be asking the question, how can we make children curious to learn, but how can we foster environments where the child is motivated to acquire more information? And that may initially be specific to things that the child is interested in. That's the direction that I want my work to go in. The extent to which these initial interests bleed over to greater overall learning. So you provide the child with an environment where it is given information that you assume it to be interested in, and it's not the case that this information is provided in a vacuum, so it bleeds over to improved learning overall. I think that's what you're seeing in a lot of the pedagogical psychology stuff from like 20, 30 years ago. They were ahead of us in this game with regards to the extent to which interest and arousal and curiosity and motivation leads to children initially persevering in a particular topic, and that perseverance bleeds over to other topics that the child didn't initially show an interest in. And maybe that's what we're doing as caregivers as well. And maybe that's also how the child develops. I mean, Raji's also got a longitudinal study right now as to the extent to which what baby is interested in time point A is the same thing that baby is interested later, the extent to which parents noticed it, the extent to which parents noticed that there's a shift from time point A to time point B, what that does to vocabulary size. Because I don't think interest is something that's constant. I don't think it stays forever. It might even change from the day of testing. So Hidi and Renninger have this beautiful model of interest, which talks about the extent to which you've got situational interests and maintained interests. And maybe, and this is something that we're exploring right now, the pupillary arousal that we're looking at is something like a situational interest. I don't know to what extent it is actually a maintained interest. And maybe what the parents are tapping into is more of a maintained interest. So that's how we're kind of currently explaining this coarse association between parental estimates and children's looking time. That maybe what the child is doing is showing its interest in a particular set of objects, which is more situational. And what the parent is doing is using their estimate of what the child knows and is talked about in the past as a more stable index of a maintained interest in the child's life. So they might actually be tapping into different kinds of interests as well.
Yeah, I think my view to that would be that it's at least possible that sustained or repeated experience with situational interest could lead to an enhanced maintained interest, because if situational interest is rewarding, then that could lead to a maintained interest. And in a sense, talking about curiosity, how trait curiosity could arise out of repeated experiences of state curiosity. But that's of course something to be tested and explored. Yeah, interesting indeed. But I guess from what you said, one would have to conclude that what you think is that all children are curious, and the main differentiation is the suitability of the environment that they experience.
And let's also go back to the fact that all children are curious, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always eliciting information that they're curious. So they're not optimal explorers. They're actually pretty crap at it from what our studies are showing.
Of course, you could even, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
No, I mean, you could even think that children who are very curious, they don't really care about what they learn. So they care less about optimality as long as they learn something, right? Like what Berline calls diverse curiosity, the general urge to explore. So there could be not an optimal, but an intermediate level of curiosity that would drive you to seek out specific information. But if you're really a very curious person, you don't care, you just take whatever's there. Another interesting thing we should explore in future is that,
Yes, exactly. You put into this state curiosity, which then leads you to just explore, not necessarily explore something that is going to further your knowledge state.
You could think exploration is so much fun, and other children or people could think finding answers to your open question is so much fun, and that can be really quite different things, right? Still okay. So people, if you want to ask questions, you probably have to ask them soon, because I'm probably running out of mine soon.
Yes. So, and I would say that we could probably go another 8 minutes or so, and then we could call it a day. And
okay. Here's one. You might have answered that, but let me ask it anyway. So curiosity affects learning, but does learning affect curiosity?
Yes,
so
it does.
Beyond the choice of the words that we learn.
I think it does.
So in which way?
Well, to the extent to which that you need something in order to know what you want to learn. You need to know what you know in order to learn what you know what you want to learn. And you need to have a base. I mean, your work is showing this beautifully, right? That you've got this intermediate level of complexity, you've got intermediate levels of knowledge. So it's not starting from nothing, although there is novelty-based arousal as well. But that's, I think, something more bottom up with regards to, oh, this is all new, and therefore I'm going to look at this. And I don't know to what extent that's going to equate to better learning. I do think learning needs to be embedded. That's what the whole preferential attachment literature is showing us. The leveraging literature is showing us that you learn better, you learn easier when you've got something to leverage off, which makes perfect sense to me, because you don't learn in a vacuum. When you're able to connect this to other sources of information, then learning is better. So I think, yes, we're building off knowledge at all times. I mean, I usually have this quote in my talk, but I don't have it now. But it's again a quote from Piaget with regards to the which that learning is essentially a successive differentiation of that what you know from that what you have just received, and that's essentially learning. And I think we spoke a lot about this when we talked about the early word learning book, with regards to the extent to which that even as adults, we're still learning. We're still learning words. If I see a weird looking bottle, that's adding to my representation of this word bottle. So I don't think word learning stops at any particular point and it becomes only word recognition. I think we're constantly accumulating information about the world around us through a process of successive differentiation, as Piaget called it. So and successive differentiation only happens when you've already got something to differentiate from. So, yes.
Yes, yeah. Very interesting. Yes, learning as differentiation. Yeah, I would agree. Well, there's one, but my thinking is also moving a bit in the direction that perhaps curiosity can be reinforced. That may be something for another time to discuss, that if you experience curiosity, that could be a reinforced behavior to seek out information, because curiosity feels good. And that, of course, thinking from that perspective, then, of course, opens the avenue to think about reinforcement in general, about extinction, about reinforcement schedules, and so on. So that's, so that curiosity itself could be malleable by experience.
Yeah, except do you think curiosity feels good, or the fulfillment of curiosity? I would imagine that the fulfillment of curiosity is what feels good. So it's the actual acquisition of knowledge rather than just the feeling of curiosity.
Yeah, so I think curiosity is the anticipation of knowledge acquisition. And that, so I think, some people isolate curiosity as a mechanism or so, like curiosity makes you do this. In my current thinking, anyway, curiosity is an epiphenomenon. It's the reward signal that accompanies the anticipation of learning, and therefore, you're quite right. The learning itself is the rewarding thing, but it's closely linked to curiosity. So if you learn, that you might seek out further learning, because that positive reward feeling is reinforced.
That's an interesting view. I'm not sure I'm with you on that, because I feel like it's, I'm with you as far as you calling it an epiphenomenon on the way to knowledge acquisition. But being constantly frustrated in knowledge acquisition cannot lead, it's an ideal world that you're living in where your curiosity is always being fulfilled. So you've got this reward signal that's associated with curiosity, but it's not always the case that is being fulfilled. Or maybe it is. Maybe this is something we need to be looking at, whether babies are always getting the information that they need.
Well, that is precisely my hypothesis, why curiosity gets less when children enter school, because it's a very kind of theoretical view, but basically preschool, they can choose whatever they want to learn. They can maintain the optimal level of complexity. When they enter school and you are in a class of 25, 30 children, although teachers, of course, nowadays at least try to individualize learning, nevertheless, you will be exposed to a lot of information that you didn't choose to learn, and that might not be optimal for your current state of learning. And that could, lead to learning experiences that are suboptimal, and therefore create extinction as opposed to reinforcement of curiosity.
Yeah, there I agree with you. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So that's again something that I'll probably think about the next few years. Now, questions are coming in, so let me quickly ask them. One is a follow-up with regard to the innatist versus bottom-up view. How do prelingual babies pick up discrete phonemes from the signal without these phonemic categories existing in the mind-brain first? And I think it might be the same person because it's in parentheses. I'm also persuaded by the bottom-up phonetically grounded view, but I'm unsure how one may respond to the above chicken-egg dilemma suggested by substance-free phonology a la Rice. I wonder if it's the same question asked as for the first question.
I think it might be, or it's just somebody picking up on that question. I think
might be the only person listening to us.
Should have talked about the phonology stuff. Yes, it is.
It is the same question asked here.
Should have talked about the phonology stuff rather than the curiosity stuff. So there's a lot of work on this with young babies, right? I mean, there's a beautiful work by Pat Kuhl's lab, which talks about the extent to which perceptual magnets are being created, where essentially you accumulate evidence about the patterns of sounds that you're being exposed to in your environment. And these patterns of sounds then cluster together such that you extract a prototype, which is the ideal, or let's call it the average sound that is specific to your particular language. And these perceptual magnets then attract other sounds that are in some way related to what your prototype looks like. So you pick up these, you're gathering statistics about the kinds of the distribution of sounds that you are exposed to in your input and use that to create prototypes is what I think is going on. I don't know. So I don't think these phonemic categories exist in the brain. I think, again, let's bring back Piaget here. It's a process of successive differentiation. That's what the mind is doing. It's working out which things are actually the same thing and which things are different, and finding out how to keep them apart in the mind
and to integrate.
To integrate. Yes, I absolutely, to integrate and to keep them apart as two different phonemes based on exposure to the input that the child is exposed to, is how I would call it.
Okay, here's another question. If it's harder.
Yeah, okay, I'm with you now. So if it's harder to learn words from narrow categories, wouldn't you expect larger pupil dilation if it reflects effort? Yes, except we're measuring the pupil dilation before the learning task. So if you're talking about the Ackerman et al. Series of studies, we're measuring there the pupillary dilation way before the novel word learning task, just by exposing them to members of different categories. So we're not measuring the pupil dilation during the word learning task in the Ackerman studies. We measured pupillary dilation during the word learning task in the Uters et al. Study, where we're looking at the extent to which we're looking at engagement during the task and how that taps into learning. It's an interesting question as to whether you would then during the task see. It's a very interesting question. I think that's a beautiful thing that we should be looking at, actually, whether you would expect increased pupillary arousal for during learning of words from more narrow categories than from broader categories. Although I would say the opposite, right? I'm sorry if I said that the wrong way around, but I would actually expect that because you can also leverage knowledge. Yes, sorry. No, you're right. It's harder to learn words from narrow categories. I'm with you again. Yes, sorry. Yeah, but that's an interesting question. I think that's something we could actually look at with the kind of data that we've got, because we've got the data during the word learning phase. And we can look at the extent to which it is harder. We see increased pupillary arousal for narrow categories as opposed to broad categories. That should be very easy to do. We have the data to do that. We can do that.
Yeah, and more broadly, it shows a way to differentiate that, right? If you find a task that's harder versus a task that's more interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, very nice.
Very nice question. Very nice. Thank you for that.
Question asker. Okay. for Nivi, it's 8:30 in the evening at the end of a probably very long day. And I hear she has dinner plans. So I suppose, unless there are some really urgent questions that you must ask now, we should thank Nivi for this really wonderful, exciting talk and for the really wonderful, exciting discussion afterwards. So I'll clap hands for representing.
I'll clap hands for you. Thank you for sitting and talking to me, Gert, on a Wednesday.
My pleasure, my great pleasure as always.
And I look forward to doing this again in Lancaster very soon. Thank you so much. And thank you for asking me and for your great questions, especially the person who gave me this idea. We will look into this data. And then if you send me an email, I might be able to tell you in a couple of weeks as to what the data is telling us, because that is a beautiful question. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we'll let you go and thank you very much.